What does it mean to be called too loud when the sound in question is the heartbeat of home? A crossroad that feels like a living room. Bricks soaked in late afternoon amber. Buses exhaling at the curb. Kids two-stepping on the corner. The persistent shimmer of congas braiding with chatter and crosswalk beeps. For nearly a quarter century on one Washington, D.C. block, a modest storefront broadcast a daily benediction in the language of go-go. Percussion forward, swaggering, neighborly. It was the kind of sound that doesn't so much demand attention as quietly hold a place together. Then, one weekday afternoon, the music stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The silence rang like a slammed door. It felt like someone had erased a line. From the neighborhood's autobiography, one of those important lines that anchors the rest. The reason was as ordinary as a bureaucratic email, and as devastating as any polite eviction. A complaint, filed in the name of quality of life, insisting that the soundtrack of Black Washington had become a nuisance. What happened next did not begin as a movement. It began as a question whispered in kitchens and text threads, then shouted on sidewalks and at City Hall. Who gets to decide what a city sounds like? That one question pulled loose a tapestry of others, about belonging, authority, and how rules written in neutral tones can be enforced with a familiar bias. A shop owner who had long curated a corner's rhythm stepped into the role of cultural steward, with a politician's stamina and a drummer's timing. Neighbors who had never lifted a sign found themselves marching with one in hand. Musicians turned speakers into megaphones, then into policy. And a city that had been quietly debating noise learned to recognize culture by its sound and write protection for it into law. This is a true story of a man told he was too loud, a community that refused to be muted, and a capital city that remembered what it means to listen to its own people. Before the complaint, before the council hearings, before anyone thought to give a home in public policy, there was simply a man, a corner, and the music that taught new arrivals how to listen. He had opened his small electronics shop in the mid-1990s, the kind of place that dealt in prepaid phones and cracked screens, chargers and cases, and, on a shelf by the register, stacks of CDs and recordings that captured go-go's unruly joy. He started pointing speakers toward the street during business hours, not as a gimmick, but as a greeting. If you walked past with a bag of groceries, if you hustled across the crosswalk to catch a bus, if you strolled with no aim at all, the drum line tucked itself behind your heartbeat and said what signs never can. Your home. The neighborhood. Around him, Shaw is a palimpsest. One surface written over another, then another, the old script still faintly visible beneath the new. In the 20th century's middle years, it was a black cultural corridor, incubating jazz and literature. Protests and storefront churches where a choir could hold off despair with four-part harmony. It survived disinvestment and the violent ache of the late 1960s, then the long, patient rebuild that followed. By the time the 2000s and 2010s remade DC's skyline, Shaw was both a memory and a promise. A place where multi-generational families shared sidewalks and stories with young professionals who understood that a neighborhood is not a commodity, but a choir you join. Go itself is a conversation. Born in Black Washington, it was designed to keep a groove going so the crowd could talk back. Long jams that blend gossip, grief, and joy. A rhythm section that can hold a block steady after a loss and make a stoop feel like a stage after a win. The city adopted it as an unofficial language. Call and response between band and audience, between corner and passerby, between the present and its history. For people who grew up in its pocket, the sound is not mere entertainment, it's infrastructure. It teaches pace and place, the subtle choreography of how strangers move together without colliding, how dignity can be both loud and tender. With new money came new frictions. Livability became a buzzword, and noise its weapon of choice. On paper, noise thresholds are neutral, decibels and distances, time windows and meters. On the ground, enforcement tends to land where power already leans, against church doors when the choir sings out in summer, against street performers who animate downtown when office towers are done for the day, against corner culture that says, "We've been here," to people who only recently got keys. City leaders debated an amplified sound crackdown that would have effectively criminalized much of the street performance and everyday culture that give DC's public realm its soul. Musicians, small business owners, elders, and teenagers sounded the alarm, pointing out that decibels alone don't tell the story. Context matters. A pocket of rhythm that holds one intersection together is not the same as an unregulated, all-hours cacophony. And even when it is time to quiet down, there's a difference between conversation and citation, between community standards set together and punishment delivered from above. The shop owner watched these debates with the patience of a man who has weathered trends and tempers alike. He had lived through years when nobody bothered to invest, and through the arrival of high-end supermarkets and sleek apartment buildings. Through it all, his speakers remained steady, louder in the early evening when working folks poured onto the sidewalk, softer when mothers pushed strollers past. He had found a level that felt right for the corner, a volume that respected the block while maintaining the practice that made his storefront more than a store. To him, the speakers weren't provocation. They were punctuation, the steady commas, and a long sentence about who belongs. It took one call, one politely worded, "We love the neighborhood, but..." One message threaded through corporate channels with the weight that comes from being attached to a new building's lease and a set of expectations imported from elsewhere. The directive arrived with the clean sting of administrative power. Turn the music off. It did not come with a sheriff or a sound meter. It arrived as an ultimatum, the kind small businesses know too well, masquerading as a request. To keep his contract, to keep his lights on, he would have to mute the playlist that had stitched the corner's afternoons together for nearly 24 years. The silence was not quiet. It was accusatory. It made the block feel like it was holding its breath. People glanced at the storefront and then at each other, unsure whether to ask. The shop owner and his staff explained in calm voices, as if the tone could make the content less absurd. The reason given was noise. The effect felt like erasure. Word traveled faster than a rumor down a hallway. It hopped from conversation to conversation, group chat to group chat. Neighbors who had not called a council office in years, if ever, dialed numbers with more urgency than decorum. "No," they said in a variety of ways. "No, you can't mute us. Not here. Not like this." Someone set up a petition online. Signatures poured in by the thousands, then tens of thousands. The comments read like love letters to a corner. On the second day, there were drums. Not because someone thought it made tactical sense, but because that is how this city says what. It means with rhythm that summons memory and forward motion at the same time. Musicians rolled congas onto the sidewalk. Rappers and singers took turns at an impromptu mic. Children climbed up on tiptoe to see. Elders nodded in time, their bodies knowing that a groove is a kind of glue. The protest was boisterous but disciplined. It did not snarl traffic for the pleasure of it. It turned the sidewalk into a seminar. "This," someone said into a bullhorn, "is not noise. This is how we tell each other that we're here." People explained the difference to anyone. Who would listen? Between intrusion and belonging, between disturbance and tradition. The corner briefly shifted north and south as the demonstration marched along corridors where go-go has long been the city's heartbeat, making clear that this was not only about one store, it was about a people's sound. The press showed up, scribbling notes on the paradox, a capital city that sells itself to the world using images and sounds shaped by black culture, now confronting the ease with which a single complaint could mute that culture's everyday presence. The story crystallized in hours because it was already written in 100 other cities. How redevelopment welcomes the aesthetics of blackness as branding while pushing out its lived practice. In DC, the move backfired. The corner's silence made people hear what they were about to lose. It clarified in an instant the stakes of a seemingly small decision. By morning on the third day, the shop owner's phone rang before sunrise. The voice on the other end belonged to someone high enough within the company to say the words that needed saying. The music can come back. He hung up, walked outside, and turned the dial to a familiar notch. The first drum loop unfurled across the intersection, and a bus driver hit the horn in a syncopated reply. A kid danced in the crosswalk. A grandmother shook her head and smiled, the expression of someone who has seen enough to be cynical and chooses not to be. It could have ended there, music restored, complaint dismissed, case closed. But the quiet had done more than anger people. It had revealed how fragile a culture is when it depends on permission rather than recognition. A movement had been born, and it was not going back to sleep. Winning back the morning is a victory. Changing the rules so you don't have to win it back again tomorrow is strategy. The people who had thrown down their work bags and grabbed drumsticks understood the difference. They named the moment and gave it a banner. Under that banner, they organized, not as a one-off protest, but as a sustained civic effort to make policy hear music, to make City Hall speak the language of a place it often claims to represent. The shop owner kept doing what he did best, opening his door on time, turning the speakers to the right level, keeping a corner welcoming, while putting in hours he didn't have for meetings and testimony. He learned the shape of a hearing room, how to time a sentence to land in the silence between scribbling staffers and the glare of a committee chair's clock. They built a coalition that looked like a block party and operated like a campaign. Cultural scholars came with data and analysis. Activists brought muscle memory from other fights against erasure. Pastors offered space and moral clarity. Musicians and DJs, producers and promoters translated urgency into a calendar of events that kept the groove going and the message fresh. Parents pushed strollers into evening meetings, teaching toddlers that democracy sometimes looks like sitting deep into bedtime. Teenagers took shifts staffing tables, collecting emails, explaining to skeptical newcomers how the word noise can be a cudgel in the wrong hands. Elders recounted late 70s block pride and taught younger organizers how to hold a microphone so people can hear you without feeling shouted down. There were setbacks. There always are. A sympathetic official nodded along in private and hedged in public. A well-meaning letter from a resident framed and asked for balance in the coded language of those people, reminding everyone why this work had to be thorough and patient. A proposed amendment to one bill would have smuggled in decibel caps that seem reasonable in a lab and function as bulldozers on a street with a history. Each time, the coalition convened. They did what they had learned to do: educate, tell stories, change minds one conversation at a time. They brought residents and musicians into the same room and asked them to talk through scenarios instead of writing rules for abstract citizens who don't exist. They suggested pilot programs. They proposed cultural impact assessments alongside sound studies. They invited council members to the corner, ears open, not for a photo op, but for a walk and a listen. The shop owner became a reluctant public figure, the kind of face people look for in a crowd because it helps them orient themselves and in the narrative. He wore the attention lightly, understanding that a single person can be a symbol, but should never be the whole show. He deflected praise toward the band that played last night's rally, toward the youth poet who lit up a town hall with a verse that made the room breathe in unison, toward the elder who brought food to every strategy session so the work could be sustained. He was clear about why this mattered. He did not say "my business" as often as he said "our corner," "our sound," "our city." The resistance had to answer hard questions, too. What does fairness look like when a nurse who works nights needs to sleep while a drummer needs to practice? How do you tell the difference between a long-standing cultural practice that defines a place and a single bad actor? Where should compromise live so it feels like stewardship, not surrender? They built principles: lead with conversation, escalate only when necessary, seek adjustments that preserve the practice, focus on design and planning, soundproofing, streetscapes and building regulations, so people can live together without constant conflict. They considered decibel limits and curfews not as sticks, but as opportunities to work with the grain of a place. They asked developers to participate in creative solutions, insulating residential units above legacy businesses, creating courtyards that keep music in rather than funneling it into bedrooms, contributing to cultural funds that support the very zines their marketing teams use to sell apartments. They told a story that moved past grievance and into stewardship. We want better, they said, not just louder. They wanted laws that made room for Black public life, which is often communal and audible, without pretending every practice is above critique. They wanted enforcement that understood context and started with conversation. They wanted training that taught inspectors and officers to distinguish between a long-standing, place-defining soundtrack and truly disruptive noise. They wanted to rewrite not only one policy section, but the muscle memory of a government used to treating culture as branding by day and a problem by night. The turning point did not look like a single champagne cork popping. It looked like a series of rooms where people who had never sat next to each other before arranged themselves on bench seats and waited to be called. It looked like a daisy chain of hearing notices. It looked like testimony written on kitchen tables after kids went to bed and rehearsed under streetlights on the walk home from the bus stop. It looked like musicians in their weekday clothes explaining to officials in suits how a pocket develops in a crowd and why it matters that a city's public spaces allow that alchemy to occur. 1. Hearing, in particular, felt like a hinge. The committee room was packed. The shop owner sat a few rows from the front, notes in his lap, watching elders and teenagers, choir directors and club owners, barbers and buskers take their turns. A young mother spoke about how the corner soundtrack made her feel safe walking home at dusk, eyes on the stroller, feet in rhythm with familiar songs. A teacher described bringing his class to the protest and watching shy students blossom into civic leaders as they collected signatures and explained the stakes. A pastor testified about Sunday mornings when his congregation spilled into the U Street after a high note and unclenched fists. A drummer placed sticks on the witness table and talked, in precise terms, about dynamics, about playing together, about turning down the one conga that cuts too sharply and lifting the other that fills a gap. The metaphor landed. We're not asking to be louder, he said. We're asking to be heard. The shop owner's testimony when it came was simple and devastating. He told the story of a corner that had held steady through good times and lean times of speakers turned just so, of a daily discipline of listening to a block that taught him how to keep a place welcome. He acknowledged the neighbor who needed sleep and the child who needed a nap. He said what the movement had been saying in 100 ways, that rules can be written to cherish culture while addressing legitimate concerns, and that the people who live with the consequences are the best designers of the solutions. Meanwhile, the coalition's policy team had done its homework. They proposed language that did not reduce the city's vibrancy to a spreadsheet. They put forward a framework that recognized legacy cultural practices and created mechanisms for protection and support. They argued for cultural impact assessments as a standard part of development reviews. They suggested a fund for cultural preservation, built from contributions by those who profit most from the city's brand. Most daringly, they argued that the city should not merely tolerate go-go and the broader soundscape of Black Washington, but name it, honor it, and embed it in law. The day the city made it official, the ceremony had the valence of a neighborhood birthday party that grew until it filled a public square. The mayor signed the bill recognizing go-go as the city's official music, and in that flourish of pen across paper, a corner story became civic story. It did not resolve every tension or eliminate every complaint. It did something better. It created a presumption in favor of belonging. It gave officials the vocabulary to defend culture, not just to police it. In speeches, leaders acknowledged that the emergency over one shop's speakers had revealed deeper truths about who gets to be audible in a city and under what conditions. The shop owner was there, pressed into photos he did not seek, smiling in the complicated way of a person whose private practice had become public policy. Outside, someone hit the first drum, and the crowd found the pocket. Law and rhythm met. in the street. For a moment it felt like the capital had learned the trick that keeps a band in time, each part distinct, all parts listening. If the climax was a signature, the resolution was the slow work of embedding a promise into practice. Policy changes, even celebratory ones, can wilt if they aren't watered. The coalition kept at it. They convened roundtables between enforcement agencies and cultural practitioners to translate new language into field practice. They helped draft guidance that encouraged inspectors to begin with education and voluntary compliance. They created tip sheets for business owners and performers, how to set up speakers, where to point amps, how to self-monitor with inexpensive meters, how to route cables so sidewalks remain safe for strollers and wheelchairs. They coached neighborhood associations on how to bring newcomers into the conversation without pitting them against long-timers. They encouraged developers to set aside funds for sound mitigation and cultural programming as a matter of standard practice, not charity. The movement's win inspired adjacent work. Advocates trained their attention on transit stations, where busking had been harassed into near inexistence, and negotiated a common-sense set of guidelines. Church leaders spearheaded a drive to help congregations afford simple soundproofing, upgrades that kept sanctuaries sonorous and neighbors rested. An urban design working group began sketching how pocket parks and plazas could be tuned for sound, not just sight. Trees placed as acoustic baffles, seating angled to allow conversation, near a small stage without overwhelming the whole block. Music educators used the moment to push for more robust arts funding in schools, arguing that a city that names music part of its civic identity has an obligation to teach it well. The cultural narrative shifted too. Where glossy marketing had once borrowed the look and feel of Black Washington without credit, institutions began giving platforms, budgets, and decision-making power to the culture bearers who keep scenes alive. Museums and libraries curated exhibitions and listening sessions that treated go-go and street culture as scholarship-worthy, not mere local color. Historical societies recorded oral histories, capturing the sound of the city, neighborhood by neighborhood, era by era, so future residents would know what it meant when someone said a corner had a pocket. Journalists assigned stories that dug beyond the initial flair, following the policy's rollout and challenges, holding the city accountable to the spirit of its declarations. And at the corner where it began, the daily practice continued. The shop opened on time. The volume knob found its familiar notch. Lunchtime playlists leaned smooth so cashiers could hear customers. Late afternoon stepped up to meet the sense of release in the air. There were still conversations, because there always should be. A neighbor asked for a slight turndown on weekdays between certain hours. The shop obliged. Another asked for a birthday shout-out for a kid who loved a particular track. The shop obliged again, smiling. Respect proved reciprocal. The sound held the corner held the sound. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Some who had framed their objection in sterile terms fell back on caricature. They just want to make noise. The coalition answered with the same patience that had won the day. We want a city that knows itself. They pointed to the policy's balancing features. They reminded skeptics that a city without the rough edges of real life is not a city, it is a showroom. And they underlined the racial reality many prefer to sidestep, that too loud often means too black in the mouths of those unused to sharing space. And that policy must be vigilant against carrying those biases into enforcement. The point is not to freeze a place in amber, but to build norms and infrastructure that let people live together with dignity intact. The movement matured, extending support to other communities facing versions of the same conflict. In Latino neighborhoods, where mariachis were being told to hush, organizers offered strategy and solidarity. In immigrant corridors where weekend markets were being squeezed by new complaint regimes, the coalition shared templates for cultural impact assessments and helped convene multilingual town halls. In historically white enclaves where bluegrass and porch concerts found themselves on the wrong side of a decibel meter, advocates made common cause, building a broader case for a city that breathes in 4/4 and 6/8, in call and response and lyric. Line.A's for the shop owner. He returned to the quieter satisfactions of a life well tended. A working cash drawer, a repaired screen handed back to a grateful teenager. A morning when the first drum loop hits the sidewalk and someone across the street can't help but smile. He learned to accept recognition graciously, a photo, a handshake, and then to redirect it toward the work still to be done. Sometimes when the sun slants just so and the block feels like a congregation, he leans in the doorway and allows himself a private acknowledgement. That stubbornness, when guided by love for a place, can be a civic virtue. This story began with a complaint and ended with a chorus, not because conflict disappeared, but because the city learned to sing through it. At its core, it asks each of us to reconsider how we use words like noise and quiet, order and livability. It asks us to notice when policy is being used as a velvet rope, and to insist that the velvet rope be replaced with a welcome mat. It asks us to recognize the racialized history of complaints about sound, the way a culture's everyday practice can be framed as disruption, and to move with both empathy and rigor toward solutions that keep us together. It asks us to build cities where the rules don't flatten difference but tune it, the way an engineer tunes a room so each instrument can be heard. What can you do? Start with listening. Walk your block with open ears. Learn the sound of your neighborhood's heartbeat, the rhythms that make your place itself. When someone calls a culture too loud, ask what they mean and whether they've considered how their preference became a standard. Get involved in the mechanics. Show up to hearings. Learn the difference between a decibel and a vibe. Advocate for guidelines that begin with conversation and only escalate when needed. Support the small businesses, musicians, churches, and street performers that keep your city human. If you're a developer, design with sound in mind. If you're an official, implement with context. If you're a neighbor, practice give and take. The choreography of urban life. Above all, remember that cities are choruses, not solo acts. When they called too loud did not take over the city's noise ordinance by shouting others down. He helped his city remember its own song and write policy in key. That's the work ahead of all of us. To protect the sounds that keep us together without drowning anyone out. To hold space for joy as seriously as we hold space for sleep. To teach our children that democracy has a rhythm and that they have a part to play. When the beat drops at your corner and your first instinct is to smile, follow it. That's not noise. That's your city, telling you you're home.